Maxim was at the edge of his powers. The morning began, as always, with the same routine: early rise, coffee in the office, a few minutes to think about what would happen next. He was an experienced neurosurgeon, on the cutting edge of medicine, saving lives every day, preventing tragedies. But that day, when everything seemed to be going his way, fate intervened. An ordinary day at the hospital, which he used to accept as part of his life, turned into an unbearable test of his strength. The phone call was brief, but its words cut his soul like a knife. "Maxim, your daughter has been in an accident. It's serious. She's in critical condition. We're on our way to the hospital. She'll be here soon." It's as if everything around us has stopped. The world didn't stop, but time began to slow down. He did not immediately understand what the interlocutor had said. Phrases dissolved without meaning. His eyes were fixed on one thing: daughter. Alice. His 14-year-old joy. The anxiety he felt in those seconds was immediately replaced by panic, and then almost instantly dissolved into emptiness. He didn't know how to act, didn't know what to do. Maxim was a doctor, a man who faced horror and tragedy every day, but he always managed to remain cold and calculating. This, however, was different. This was his life, his daughter, and no amount of knowledge, no amount of training had prepared him to be the kind of man who kept his cool at times like this. The bell cut off, and Maxim, unable to collect himself, sprinted out of the office. His steps were not quick, they were mechanical. It was as if he was moving by inertia, not realizing what he was doing, where he was. He knew that he had to find his colleagues, that they had to help him, but his thoughts were blurred, unclear. He was not interested in other people's problems, not interested in his patients. He was thinking only of her. His daughter, who just yesterday was laughing, reading a book before bed, and going to volleyball practice. And now, suddenly everything had changed. His mind resisted the thought that her life hung in the balance. Why? Why her? She was so young, so full of life. And suddenly it was all so fragile, so vulnerable. He couldn't bear the thought that his little girl might not survive this moment. The hospital didn't seem as familiar and cozy as it had before. Its walls, which had always been so familiar and calm, were now alien and gloomy. He ran through corridors in which every room, every office had been familiar to him, but now they seemed meaningless. The people in white coats, who usually made him feel confident, were now like shadows, irrelevant. All he could see was his daughter, his Alice, who now lay on the operating table, not knowing what was happening to her. When Maxim finally reached the emergency room, his gaze immediately fell on the stretcher on which his daughter lay lifelessly. She was surrounded by orderlies, doctors, and everyone was focused on bringing her to consciousness. But there was something constant in her condition that was impossible to ignore. She was so fragile, so defenseless. Maxim stopped, unable to move. This was his daughter, but right now she was nothing more than a patient. "Maxim, we're doing everything we can. We have to give it time," he heard the doctor's voice. It was one of his colleagues, Dr. Ivan, who seemed to be the only person who didn't look at him as just a concerned father. He saw him as a colleague, undaunted by his professionalism. Maxim didn't answer, only nodded, trying to hide his fear and helplessness from his colleagues. He wasn't ready for this. He wasn't ready to see his daughter in such a state. He was ready to save other people's lives, but he didn't know how to fight for hers. The operation was started at once. The doctors acted quickly and confidently, but for Maxim, who was standing next to her, every movement became more difficult. His mind darted from memories of her smile to horrible pictures of what was happening to her body in those moments. He saw how her body was a canvas for doctors, and how her life hung in the balance. All of this was coupled with the painful feeling that she was slipping away from him, that her life and health were no longer in his hands. She had been his daughter, his pride, his little girl, and now all of that had somehow disintegrated in an instant. "We're trying, Maxim, but the injuries are too serious," the doctor who performed the operation told him. Maxim felt something tighten in his chest. The words were like a judgment. At that moment, he realized there was nothing more he could do. He couldn't intervene. He couldn't help. He was unable to control this moment, unable to change her fate. And that thought hurt him so much that he didn't know how to deal with it. "You have to be with her." "Just be with her," Dr. Ivan said, trying to give at least a small comforting phrase. But Maxim couldn't understand how he should feel. How could he be with her when she was already almost lost? How could he look at her and not feel that all he could do was just wait and hope? Sophia, his wife, entered the room while the operation was still in progress. She was exhausted, but her eyes sought him out as if they were the only source of light in this dark and cold corridor. She knew how he felt, but her gaze spoke more than words. She had come to support him, but she herself was in the same hell he was in. She was in the same pain as he was. But she didn't come to comfort him, she came because they were together. "Maxim, what is the matter with her?" Her voice was shaky, like a last ray of hope. Maxim looked at her face, and his heart clenched even tighter. He didn't know what to say. He wanted to say that everything would be all right, that she would recover, that it was only a temporary affliction, but he couldn't lie. He knew her life hung in the balance. "We'll do what we can," he said, but he didn't even believe in those words. There was no hope or faith in his head. He saw Sophia hugging him, trying to give him some strength, but he couldn't shake the feeling that all was lost. Maxim stood gritting his teeth with an invisible weight on his shoulders as the surgeon, Dr. Fernando, continued to instruct him as if everything that was happening was just another routine operation. His hands were sure, but his gaze was intense. There was a flicker of anxiety in his eyes as he tried to persuade Maxim not to interfere with the process. "Maxim, you have to back off," Dr. Fernando said without raising his head, still keeping a close eye on the patient's condition. "You know how this works. Let us do our job. You can't be both a doctor and a father at the same time. I can't let you work the way you want to work." These words echoed in Maxim's mind, piercing him like a needle. He knew perfectly well that Dr. Fernando was right. It was impossible to be a doctor and a father at the same time. But every instinct, every cell in his body was screaming for something else. He was willing to do anything to help his daughter. He wanted to be there for her, not remain a bystander, no matter how much Fernando tried to comfort him. "But I'm her father," Maxim snapped, unable to hold back. His voice was shaking with rage and helplessness. "I can't just sit and watch. This is my daughter, and you're telling me not to interfere. Do you really think I can be indifferent?" Fernando looked at him, and there was a shadow of regret in his eyes. He knew that Maxim was an outstanding doctor, that he was a man of incredible knowledge and experience, but what was happening now was too personal. Too painful. Dr. Fernando was silent, trying to find words that could comfort Maxime, but at the same time he knew that his words wouldn't change anything. "I understand what you're going through, Maxim. We all do. But you can't save her if you lose yourself in it. You have to be with her, support her, but don't try to save her through your work," he said quietly, not daring to look into Maxim's eyes. Maxim stood silently beside him, clenching his fists. He tried to understand Fernando's words, but a storm was raging inside him. He was a doctor, and it was his job to save people. It was what he was meant to do. And now he had to sit and watch his daughter fight for her life, knowing he couldn't intervene. How was that possible? Why did he feel so helpless? Dr. Fernando paused, giving Maxim time to comprehend his words, but soon turned and added, "If you want to help, trust us. We'll do what we can. But don't interfere with the process. You'll only make things more difficult." Fernando's words sounded firm, but with understanding. Maxim wanted to object, but couldn't. He knew that deep down Fernando was right. With each step, each moment in which he remained in the background, his pain only grew worse. But he still couldn't bring himself to back down. Couldn't reconcile himself to the fact that his daughter was out there, in danger, and he couldn't save her. Meanwhile, in the operating theater, a new tension had arisen. The young and ambitious Dr. Ivan, who had just completed his residency, never stopped suggesting new treatments, new ways to save her. He looked at Maxim with passion, as if he was ready to fight to the last for his patient, despite all the objective risks. "Dr. Fernando, maybe we should try the protocol that was recently discussed at the conference?" "We can do it. Maybe it will give us a chance," Ivan said, not hiding the excitement in his voice. Maxim looked back at him doubtfully. Ivan was just a young doctor who didn't have much experience yet. He looked at the world filled with hope, unlike Maxim, who knew that there were times when one had to accept that not everything could be controlled. "Are you offering us a new method that you yourself only know about in theory?" Maxim asked, his voice cold and hard. "We are already dealing with a critical condition. There is no time for experiments." Ivan, however, did not give up. He was ambitious and truly believed that this experiment could save a life. For him, it was more than just a job, it was a chance to prove his case, to prove to himself and others that he was capable of more. "But you don't understand. It can work. I've read the studies. I know this method has been used in several cases, and it has shown improvement. We should at least try it." Maxim sighed and looked at Ivan. There was a storm in his eyes, but he tried to remain calm. "Do you realize that if we start with this experiment now, the consequences could be unpredictable?" "We're risking her life," Maxim said, feeling a heaviness building up in his chest. "You think I don't know what risk is? I live it every day. But if we choose this path and lose her, you'll live with that for the rest of your life." Ivan blushed, but kept insisting. He was sure there was a chance. And his words were perhaps the last thread of hope for Maxim. But despite all his ambition and desire, Maxim couldn't afford to give in to it. Dr. Fernando intervened, speaking in a soothing tone. "We won't take any chances. This is not the case. We will proceed with the plan we have. We will do the best we can." Maxim closed his eyes, trying to come to his senses. He knew Fernando was right, they couldn't take any chances. They had to proceed according to strict protocols, without unnecessary experimentation. But every time he heard the footsteps of the nurses and doctors, every time he saw their confidence, he realized that none of them were experiencing what he was experiencing. His world was crumbling, and they were just doing their jobs. He felt his inner world crumbling with every hour of waiting. He sat beside her bed, holding her hand, silently looking at her, gazing at her face, trying to find one sign, one reaction that would tell him she was still alive, that she was still fighting. And just then, when everything around him seemed utterly silent, Maxim felt an unbearable heaviness in his heart. He was a doctor. He knew how to save lives, knew how to fight disease. But right now, in front of him was his daughter. She wasn't a patient. She was part of him, his blood and flesh, and he couldn't save her. All his knowledge, all his experience, was nothing compared to what he was facing now. And it was destroying him. As a doctor, he saved people every day, but now that his own daughter lay before him, fighting for her life, he didn't know how to be. He felt his principles, his beliefs, and his goals crumbling with every moment spent in that hospital room. He was not ready to surrender her into the hands of fate. Maxim felt guilty for not being able to save her. The feeling was tearing him up from the inside out. He wasn't ready to fight it, and his inner struggle grew more and more fierce. Sophia sat next to Maxim, their hands barely touching, but the distance between them had become as tangible as if they were on different ends of the world. They were both silent. Time stretched on endlessly, but neither of them could break the silence. All the conversations they had had before made no sense. They were going through the same pain, but there was no way they could find a way to share it between them, to at least lighten the weight they were carrying a little. Sophia, who had always seemed so strong, always finding the right words, now didn't know what to say. She tried to support Maxim, but her words sounded hollow, as if they were losing all power with each step, with each new moment of waiting. "Do you believe she'll be all right?" she asked, her voice barely audible, as if she was afraid to say those words out loud, afraid to hear the answer. Maxim did not answer at once. He tried to find something to reassure her, something that might bring back at least the illusion of hope. But he couldn't. He knew that all his confidence and knowledge meant nothing now. He was on the brink. He didn't know what to do. Every moment, every second was becoming more and more unbearable for him. "I don't know, Sophia," he finally answered, his voice low and cracked. "I want to believe that everything will be okay, but I can't guarantee it. I can't promise you anything." Sophia fell silent, her eyes filling with tears. The same thought kept bubbling inside her head. Why does this have to happen to us? Why our daughter? Why our family? She tried to be strong, tried to hold herself together for Maxim's sake, for Alina's sake, but her strength melted away with every look on his face, with every moment she saw him lose himself, lose faith. "You have to be with her," she said, and a note of despair slipped into her voice. "You can't just walk away. You're her father. You have to believe in her. You have to believe that she'll fight. And you have to fight for her." Maxim couldn't answer her. He didn't know how to fight. He was a doctor, he should have known what to do. He knew that her life now depended not only on doctors, but on miracles, on willpower, on some inner, invisible forces. But how could he believe that when every cell in his body screamed that there was very little chance? When he, as a doctor, knew that the reality was much bleaker. Sophia stood up and walked to the window, staring out into the empty space, into the dark cityscape that seemed as cold and inhuman as this situation. She could feel her strength draining away as she herself was losing ground beneath her feet. She could no longer support Maxim as she had done before. She couldn't even give him that little bit of hope that he wanted so much. Maxim at this time was looking at his daughter again. Alina was his life. His whole life was devoted to her and Sophia. He remembered her as a little girl, like that first time he and Sophia had brought her to the beach. It had been summer and Alice had been so funny in her brightly colored swimming costume with a bow on her head, which she had asked was the prettiest thing in the world. He remembered how afraid she was of the water, but every time she and Sophia let her go in the water, she came back, all wet, but with such pride on her face as if she had conquered an entire ocean. "I'm not afraid. I can do it," she would say then, with such earnestness that Maxim and Sophia could not help laughing. And now her body lay motionless on the operating table, and all that could remain of that little girl were memories. Maxim tried to keep in his mind the moment when she had first learnt to swim. He remembered her small hands, trying so hard to grasp the water, and how proud she had been that she had made it, despite her fear. She had always been like that, determined, strong, but at that moment, when her life hung in the balance, it was hard for Maxim to know where that strength, that determination, remained. Every memory of her childhood was torn to shreds, turning into pain. He thought of how she had taught her and Sophia how to use the computer, how she had wanted to be first in everything, how she had persuaded them to keep her for more than one night at the school party despite their doubts. And in every one of those moments was her determination, her ability to fight, her laughter and her little joys. Maxim felt his heart breaking. He wanted to believe that she would come back to life. He wanted to be sure that everything he knew as a doctor would help. But it wasn't enough. He didn't know if his faith and knowledge would be enough to bring her back. What if it didn't work? What if her life was no longer in his hands? Sophia, returning from the window, sat down beside him. She didn't say a word, just took his hand. It wasn't a comfort. It wasn't a promise that everything would be okay. It was just an affirmation that they were together, that even in this unbearable silence, despite the pain and suffering, they held each other. And that was all they could do. "Remember when you taught me how to ride a bicycle?" she asked suddenly, when her hands were already gripping his palm with such force, as if she was trying to keep him from collapsing. Maxim raised his head sharply. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. But she, despite her weakness, did not move away from him. She tried to be strong. Tried to hold herself together, even though her soul was torn as well. She reminded him that they were a team, that every moment with their daughter was so important that they had to keep fighting. He couldn't let them give up. "I'll always remember her that way." His voice was strained, squeezed. She'd always been like this. Always strong. No matter what was happening now. Sophia sighed and turned to him, her eyes full of pain, but there was strength in them too. "We can still do something," she said quietly but firmly, almost without a sound. "We still have to fight." Maxim looked at her. He saw in her eyes not only suffering, but incredible strength. She was fighting too, but there was less and less hope inside her. She could feel herself losing him, both of them losing the very possibility of survival. There was unbearable pain in that, but it was their mutual decision not to give up until it was clear what was happening. Sophia sat next to Maxim, her fingers resting on his arm, but she could feel the barrier, the invisible wall that had grown between them from the moment they had been in this hospital. She stared at him, her eyes full of pain, but also a desperation she couldn't hide. Every look, every gesture became a struggle for her. She tried to support him, but what could she give him if she was losing herself? How could she comfort him when you were falling apart inside? How could she support him when you could barely stand on your own feet? Maxim felt her eyes on him. He could see how she was trying to understand him, how she was looking in his eyes for at least a modicum of reassurance. But he himself was on edge. He didn't know what to do, didn't know how to deal with what was happening. He was a strong doctor, but now he had his daughter in front of him, his little girl, and he couldn't save her. All his skills, all his knowledge of life and death had no meaning here, in this situation. He sought comfort in her eyes, but they couldn't give him what he was looking for. He saw her suffering, her emptiness, her confusion. She was as lost as he was. But she did not give up. She tried to help him, even though she needed support herself. Every look, every second of silence between them stretched like an eternity. "Sophia, I don't know. I can't lose her," he said, his voice shaking like brittle glass, ready to shatter with any inadvertent word. "I have to do something." Sophia sighed and looked at him. She couldn't find the words to comfort him. She couldn't give him back that confidence he so desperately sought. All she could do was be there for him, be the one to support him, no matter how hard it was. But her own pain was so closely intertwined with his that she couldn't separate herself from him. "You have to trust us, Maxim," she said, her voice barely audible. "We all have faith in her strength. You must hold on, for her." Maxim looked at her, and her words seemed to be some last island on this boundless ocean of despair. But still, even those words could not completely comfort him. He was searching for something more, something deeper. He felt empty inside, in a way he had never felt before. His worldview, everything he had believed in and believed to be true, was now crumbling before him. He didn't know what to do. How could he contain the pain that was tearing him from the inside out? At that moment his gaze fell on Sophia again. He was looking for support, but she was on edge herself. He noticed the way her hand tightened around his, as if she were trying to imprint this moment in her memory. It was the last attachment they both had left, the last vestige of a bond that could not be broken. It was as if the relationship between them had become transparent, as if everything that had once bound them together was now out in the open as something fragile and vulnerable. The very emptiness they were both drowning in, unable to fight for air, was visible in their eyes. The hospital, which had once seemed a familiar and safe place, was now foreign, even frightening. Cold, sterile corridors, whitewashed walls that now only emphasized the loneliness. The bright lights that usually symbolized life and movement now seemed dim and faint, like barely burning candles at the end of a long night's journey. Every room, every turn in the corridor was like a reminder that everything in this hospital happened according to strict rules, without emotion, without human involvement. There was no room for hope, only procedures, diagnoses, and waiting. Sounds, they became for Maxim a symbol of the collapsing reality. Every step of the orderlies, every slight noise that came from the neighboring rooms seemed like an echo of some unknown threat. The alarm signals on the machines, which did not stop for a minute, seemed to him terrible warnings. They sounded like sentences which he could not avoid. Every movement, every sound in this hospital exacerbated his sense of loss, and every breath he took became even more labored. But there was one small spark in this nightmare that he noticed immediately, and perhaps that was his salvation. In the ward where Alice lay, amidst the bright lamps and sterile cleanliness, there was one small flower. It had been brought by Sophia a few days ago. She couldn't help but bring it with her. It was a tiny bouquet of wild flowers that she had placed on the nightstand next to her daughter's bed. Flowers seemed impossible to exist in this place. They were a bright spot in this lifeless, cold environment with which she brought a modicum of human warmth. The flowers were impeccably beautiful, even if they had no reason to exist in this place. Maxim was struck by this contrast. He looked at the flowers, and for a second he felt something unusual, not just the beauty, but the small spark of life they were all trying so desperately to preserve. This small detail, this tiny sign of a living, natural world, was like a reminder that life doesn't end, even if it seems like everything is irrevocably gone into the void. Absorbed in this moment, Maxim forgot about the world around him for a moment. He remembered how Alice loved to walk in the park. How she and Sophia used to go there with her every summer, how she had been a little girl who looked at all the flowers and plants with delight, pointing at each new open world. There was always something extraordinary in her eyes, curiosity, eagerness to explore the world. And this little detail in the chamber, this flower, reminded him again how she had looked at the world with the same curiosity as she had once looked at these very flowers. Maxim glanced at Sophia. She was sitting with him, her eyes now closed, and her hands squeezed him tighter than ever. She was silent, but her gaze never left his. It was the look she had once given him in the days when they had just walked in the park, when nothing troubled them, when all of life seemed filled with light. It was the look that said everything that needed to be said. Maxim felt something warmer pierce his chest. It wasn't exactly comforting, but it was the feeling that they weren't alone. And maybe that was all they could have. Time passed, but it seemed to stand still. Moments stretched to infinity, each second hand on the walls of the hospital ticking away like a death sentence. Maxim sat next to Alina, his eyes never leaving her motionless body, those monstrous devices that measured her vital signs, not leaving hope, but not giving final certainty either. He realized that time was running out and every moment could be his last. With each passing minute, his soul became more and more filled with guilt, as if he could have done more, if anything at all. When the chief surgeon, Dr. Fernando, walked into the room and offered Maxim and Sophia an alternative treatment, an experimental protocol that had only recently begun to be used in the world of medicine, they couldn't refuse. The whole world seemed to have emptied out, but this chance was something they could latch onto. A new method, not fully tested, but with the prospect of bringing Alina back to life. A brain stimulation protocol for patients in deep coma sounded like a salvation island in the stormy ocean of their pain and despair. Maxim, as a doctor, had his doubts. He knew that such cases were too few to conclude that the method would work. But his heart, his paternal instinct, his love for Alina were pulling him in that direction. It was all he could hope for. At one point, his eyes crossed with Sophia's. He saw her eyes trying to find an answer, her hand squeezing his, expressing the same determination. It was their only decision, and they agreed to the experiment. Alina's recovery process began immediately after the protocol was taken. For the first few hours, they saw no significant changes. The monitors continued to display the same old, unimpressive graphs. Alina remained motionless, her breathing controlled by the machines, and her body seemed only a shadow of the girl they knew. It was hard to stay strong when nothing was changing. Sophia sat beside him, her eyes staring into the void, but they continued to fight, believing that every moment could bring change. Days passed, and at some point, in the first few days after the treatment had started, Maxim noticed a small sign. It was like a flash on the monitor screen, a barely perceptible movement that could not be perceived other than as a sign. It was a slight change, a small, almost imperceptible spike in the graphs. Dr. Fernando, who was also monitoring the process, couldn't hold back a relieved smile. It could be a response to a stimulus, he said, but his voice was careful, restrained. We'll have to keep an eye on it. But it's a good start. Maxim felt his heartbeat faster. He was a doctor, and he knew not to jump to conclusions. But inwardly he already felt it. this was not just a random fluctuation. It was a signal, and perhaps it was the first in a chain of events that could bring Alina back. The recovery process was a long one. Moments of hope were interspersed with moments of despair when nothing changed. Sophia could no longer hold back her tears, and Maxim sat alone in the corridor more and more often, his hands nervously going through documents, but his thoughts kept returning to Alina. At times, he caught himself that he could no longer listen to the monotonous sound of the machines. All he could think about were her eyes, her words, her dreams. He saw her as she used to be, laughing, running around the house, dreaming of being a doctor like him, and now her life hung in the balance. But the little signs didn't stop. Every day there was a subtle change in the ward. On the second day after starting the protocol, Alina moved her fingers a little. It was no more than a reflex, but to Maxim it was magic. He looked at Sophia, their eyes meeting. She was silent, but there was everything in her gaze: fear, hope, and unbearable pain. "It's something," Maxim whispered, his voice full of unspeakable pain and relief. "She can hear us." Dr. Fernando, when he heard about the reaction, came with new data. There was no longer any doubt. Alina had begun to respond to stimuli. Step by step, day by day, her brain activity slowly recovered. The progress was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. For Maxim and Sophia, this was the last chance they could hope for. When, a few days later, Alina, without opening her eyes, raised her hand slightly to latch onto Maxim's finger, it was more than they could have expected. She was there. She was with them. It was so insignificant, yet so huge in the context of their fight. Maxim stood beside her, his hand gripping hers tightly. In those moments, he forgot everything: the struggle, the pain, the past. He was with her, and that was enough. Sophia approached too, her gaze full of hope. "Can you hear us, Alice?" she asked, her voice quiet, restrained, as if she was afraid to say the words out loud. "We are with you. We will always be with you." Alina didn't answer. But she kept fighting. And that was enough. The recovery process was excruciating, and the journey was not yet complete. Each day brought new challenges, each step towards recovery was painful, but still a step forward. Progress was slow, but now Maxim and Sophia could see it like a light at the end of the tunnel. It wasn't a miracle, it was their own struggle. A fight for her life. Weeks later, when Alina was coming round more and more, when her eyes began to open, when she began to recognize them, when her first faint but obvious gesture was a sign of real improvement, Maxim and Sophia realized what they had done. They had brought her back. They had survived the worst moments of their lives, and now they had the chance for a new beginning in front of them. And so, when Alina finally sat up on the bed, her parents' tired but happy face was full of tears. Maxim hugged her, and her small arms wrapped around his neck, as they had once done when she was a little girl. Sophia stood beside him, her eyes filled with tears, but there was no more fear in them, only gratitude and peace. "You're back," Maxim said, his voice full of relief and love. "I'm with you," Alina whispered, her voice weak but so dear. For Maxim and Sophia, this moment was the culmination of everything they had experienced. Although the journey was still long, they knew that their daughter had come back to life.